Hey guys, welcome back. Today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the role of government in a mixed economy again, but we're going to focus on the first two that we went over last time, and that's going to be maintaining legal and social framework as well as maintaining competition. So, as a refresher, role of government is small but important in the United States. The government tries not to interfere in most aspects of the economy, but it will step in, and there are 6 total roles. Again, we're going to cover the first 2 today. So the first one is maintaining legal and social framework, and this is kind of that idea of rule of law, protecting private property, protecting the common good, and that kind of thing. And I've got a couple examples to go over with ways that the United States government has done this in the last few years, or in the last 100 years, as it turns out. But I want to start kind of talking about the basic idea of the way our government has handled most economic issues in our country. And I want to make sure that we talk about that as we kind of get going. All right. So we get involved to maintain legal framework and social framework and competition. It's just what the government's going to do. When our nation was founded, we believed in this idea of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire was the idea that came from the French that basically means leave it alone. The government did not want to be involved in the economy. When our country was founded and we wrote our first constitution, when we had our first Congress, we chartered a bank for the first 20 years of our existence. It was called the Bank of the United States. And basically what happened in 1791, they got a 20-year charter. In 1811, our Congress said, we don't need a bank. We don't need a national bank to do this. We need to get out of the economy. And that kind of persisted. And again, we would ultimately start a bank back up in a couple years. But again, the idea, what is the role of the government in the economy, has been something that's really kind of been there, which is why it's important that we take note that we have these 6 roles, these 6 definitive roles that have been identified as what our government does in our economy. All right, so the first one was maintain social and legal framework. And one way we've seen that is in the meatpacking industry. Now we're going back in time for this one, all right? And we're going to talk a little bit about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. You guys are going to read a couple excerpts from it, and try to use those as a primary source to figure out why we might want to pass a Meat Inspection Act and a Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, his square deal going into place here, completely influenced by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. In The Jungle, Upton Sinclair talked about the conditions at a Chicago meatpacking plant. And let's say that they weren't good. And I want you guys to read these, and I want you guys to pick up on what was happening in these meatpacking plants and see why the government needed to step in this circumstance. And I think most of you, if not all of you, will agree that the government needed to step in this circumstance. The next one will be Napster and intellectual property, and this is something that's ongoing today with file sharing. All right, just last week, Taylor Swift pulled all of her music off the popular streaming service Spotify because she wasn't getting paid enough for that music. But it kind of started with Napster. You could make the argument that it started years before that, when we were able to record tape cassettes and we could pull top 40 songs off the radio and trade with our friends. But for our purposes, we're going to talk the internet age. We're going to talk about Napster. Napster was a peer-to-peer file sharing service. Basically, on a certain folder in my computer, I kept music, and what would happen is that music would be up in the searchable database for other people, and they could download it over the internet off of my computer. And that's what we saw as Napster was. And it was a service where I could reach out and grab music that I did not own from somebody else's computer, and I would get it without paying for it. It was great. College kids loved it. Why do I have to buy new music? I'll just download it. And we saw this kind of prevalent throughout the 2000s. I remember when I got to college, they had all kinds of different ways that you could get music, and there's still a lot of different ways that you guys can get music today without paying for it. But again, each time that one of these sites pops up, you can take the Pirate Bay, for example. The Department of Justice will usually get involved to protect the intellectual property and the entrepreneurship of the people that have created that music. So Napster was here, right? Metallica found out when they started hearing one of their demo songs on the radio that somehow this was being shared across the country, and it came back to Napster. Metallica brought suit saying that it was a violation of their intellectual property. Intellectual property is the idea that what I create and what I record or what I write or what I make is the property of me. And I have the choice of how much I want to sell for it. If I want to sell it, how much I want to sell it for. All of that. Metallica was in the business of making music, still is in the business of making music. So when the opportunity came that people were starting to download their entire back catalog for free, as well as getting their new unreleased demo versions of songs, it became a concern. They brought suit. Ultimately, Napster was told to keep track of all of their files and make sure that none of the files being downloaded were copyrighted, and they couldn't do it and ended up filing for bankruptcy in 2001. Right, this suit was brought in about 2000. The first suit against him was brought in 1999. But what you start to see is you start to see all of a sudden Napster now gets shut down because it was violating the intellectual property, the efforts of the gentleman in Metallica to write these songs, to record these songs. That was their livelihood, and they wanted to make sure that they were getting paid for it. And all of a sudden they weren't getting paid for it, and it became an issue. And that's why we still kind of see these file sharing websites getting in trouble. We still kind of see that these people deserve to be paid for the work that they've created. Another notable intervention is in the Toyota and GM defective cars in the last 5 or 6 years. Toyota had defective gas pedals that would stick and cause the car to randomly accelerate. This led to 12 total deaths over the course of about 10 years. GM had defective ignitions in their cars that would shut off. It turned out that if you had multiple keys on your keychain when you put it into your GM car, the weight might shut the ignition off as the key is like being attempted to pull out. But basically they had these defective parts in it, and both companies denied that they were defective at first, even though they caused deaths. GM caused about 21 deaths. So Toyota went as far as to protect its brand image as saying, it's, come in and we'll replace your floor mats because the gas pedal's sticking to your floor mats, and that's what's going on. GM kind of said, we've got an issue, we're going to recall 2.5 million cars, which is quite a bit. But in total, 33 deaths occurred. And a way to kind of get companies to comply and to prove that it's not okay to have defective parts and to cover up those defective parts, both companies were fined significantly. Toyota was fined $1.2 billion by the federal government for their actions in covering up what was wrong with the cars and trying to say it's sticking to your floor mats. GM was only fined $35 million, but both companies had to pay for their actions. And that's one of the ways that the government tries to maintain it, is through the use of fines. The maintaining competition part is a little bit different. Is the government's trying to make sure that everyone has a fair shot for the most part. The ultimate goal of maintaining competition is to protect you, the consumer. We're going to take a look at a couple of the different ones. Roosevelt the Trustbuster is the first one. We've already talked about it a little bit, but in 1903, he went after Northern Securities, which was controlled by J.P. Morgan and some of his friends that controlled 85% of the tracks in the northern United States. And it all came about because there was a railroad company in a town that wanted to get a track to Chicago so that they could kind of get things from the hub, and it was Burlington out west. And basically, because they were struggling to do it and they couldn't get the rights to travel on the rails that were owned by Northern Securities, it became a very unfair business practice, which brought the President of the United States in. And the Department of Justice reviewed the case and ultimately broke up J.P. Morgan's trust, Northern Securities. And what we saw with that is we saw this opportunity for quite a few people to start to kind of look at this and see how this stuff was going down. And Roosevelt would go on to keep his nickname and keep breaking these trusts up that were taking advantage of these situations. And that was seen as unacceptable by our federal government. That's one thing that they tried to do to fix it. We've talked extensively about the monopoly and antitrust suit against Microsoft for their, here, use my Microsoft network, my MSN, and it'll disable all of your other options for internet. So again, they were brought up on that, and I don't want to talk much more about Microsoft. We've already talked about Microsoft quite a bit. But one of the ways that the government tries to maintain competition is through antitrust actions, which they wanted to originally break Microsoft up, and also through fines. And Microsoft was fined $1 million a day until they had fixed the problem where it was disabling the competition's web browsers. So it's very important to notice that, the government will try to influence proper behavior through fines. And you can say the same thing even down to us as citizens. They want us to go a certain speed. If we don't go a certain speed, we get fined. And it's an important part to kind of look at as we kind of see. Another intervention happened when AT&T and T-Mobile tried to merge. So AT&T came out and said they were going to buy T-Mobile from the German company that runs T-Mobile. And what we saw that, people were like, oh, okay, whatever. But the Department of Justice jumped in because if T-Mobile was acquired by AT&T, what you saw was almost 43% of the cellular market, nearly 50% of the cellular market controlled by one company, leaving smaller companies like Verizon and Sprint and Boost and Metro PCS and Cricket and US Cellular without a lot of options. And what would happen is AT&T and T-Mobile could influence the prices and control different things. And the Department of Justice deemed that that would not be fair for competition over a long period of time. So what we started to see is we started to kind of see that the Department of Justice said you can't do that, and AT&T ultimately backed off of purchasing T-Mobile, and that's why we still have two separate companies. And it's an important piece to kind of recognize is that they will step in because it could have affected you. And before it did, the government stepped in. The government will also grant natural monopolies. And what a natural monopoly is it will exist when there's only one firm that can exist. When we think about stuff like our power company or a gas utility company, when we think about Indiana, Michigan Power, we think about, how many different sets of power lines do we want running? How many different sets of cable lines do we want running? How many different gas lines do we want underground? And it's important that we take the moment to kind of think about that and say, well, if we got gas lines running all over underground, how do we know who to call when there's a leak? Or how do we know who to call before we dig? And it's important to kind of think about that because, if we're going to go through and do that, we want to make sure that we have one source to go to. So what we have to do is we have to take this into consideration and look, ultimately they protect you against price gouging and increases in price, and they make it so that you are aware, and they offer these opportunities, and they protect you, the consumer, from having too high of a bill. But they are granted that natural monopoly by the government because the government has determined that there should only be one power company in our area. There should only be one gas company in our area. We shouldn't have many other options to get gas or power because it would be a mess with our infrastructure. The same thing goes with roads. We can look at roads like the toll road, which is not a public good necessarily, because what we'll see when we look at public goods is that a private company owns the toll road, but you don't want a private company owning each stretch of the toll road because then you may not have uniform prices on the toll road. It could become very confusing for drivers and could cause, different amounts of traffic and travel patterns, which could ultimately harm the area in which the traffic's no longer going. So it's important that we kind of take a look at those natural monopolies as well. In summary, the government will intervene, and there's not been many cases where the government sits back and says, okay, that's okay. The government is involved in our economy, and they justify it via using things like consumer protection, entrepreneur protection, and competition protections to make it so that we can kind of feel like what is being done by our government is acceptable to us. And with that, in closing, I got those attached questions, a couple pieces from the jungle I'd like you guys to take a look at. And again, hopefully you can look at those and kind of move forward and look at that as we kind of go. Up next, we'll talk about providing public goods and the redistribution of income. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys soon.